Wow, thanks so much, Chris. Introductions like that always make me feel like I've just been to my own funeral. No pressure. Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for having me here this morning in Meanjin on the home of the Turrbal and Jagera people. I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and pay my respects to elders past and present. In the words from the Uluru Statement from the Heart, First Nations people have lived on this land according, and I quote, according to the reckoning of our culture from the creation, according to the common law from time immemorial, and according to science for more than 60,000 years. We are so fortunate to live in a country with the oldest continuous cultures on earth to learn from and draw on. As Galway Yunupingu once said, this land is our backbone. It's part of us, our support structure, giving us life and making everything else possible. If we are going to protect this beautiful country, if we're going to reverse the damage that we've already done, then we have to embrace that wisdom. It's one of the many reasons that our government is committed to establishing the Indigenous voice to Parliament. It's why we're expanding Indigenous protected areas right across Australia. And it's why we're doubling the number of Indigenous rangers employed to protect and manage land and sea. Can I also thank the hosts of today's event, the Queensland Conservation Council. The council represents over 50 local conservation groups dotted around this great state. It just goes to show that environmentalism is not limited to any one place or any one class of people or any side of politics. Farmers, surfers, weekend bushwalkers, families on their summer camping trip, city people volunteering their time to pull shopping trolleys out of creeks. We all want to protect the things that make us uniquely Australian. Go anywhere in this country and people will tell you how much they love our landscapes and special places and how much they cherish our native plants and animals. And as the Minister for the Environment, I can tell you that nothing gives me hope like watching community organisations and environmental groups in action. You have a really stellar lineup of people to speak with you today, and it's so wonderful to be sharing the stage with the Queensland Minister for the second time today. We've already had a press conference and a memorandum of understanding signed this morning with Megan Scanlon. Great to have you here, Megan. The Shadow Minister, and I know environmentalists and others from across Queensland. Friends, at the federal election, Labor made a number of really significant promises in the environment portfolio, and I really do have to pay tribute to Terry Butler, who is our Shadow Minister, for the enormous amount of good work she did. Our commitments including providing a full response to the Samuel Review of the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, reforming our national environmental laws, and establishing a new Environment Protection Agency. When you add them up, that is the biggest environmental reform agenda in a generation. And today we're taking the next step toward realising it. This morning, our government released our formal response to the independent review of Australia's Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act. And I really want to thank and pay tribute to the author of that independent review, Professor Graham Samuel, and the team he led for their significant contribution. I want to acknowledge the dedication and the insight that they brought to their work. Since becoming the Minister for Environment and Water, this is the second major report I've responded to after the State of the Environment in July. And while those two reports started with very different purposes, they both ended up telling the same very disturbing story. Our environment is in a state of decline, and that decline is now accelerating. It doesn't matter where you live in Australia, the signs of that decline are all around us. our oceans filling with plastics, it's our native plants being overwhelmed by invasive species, it's our beaches eroding, it's our rivers drying up, it's our fish dying, firstly from not enough water and then from too much. It's our topsoil blowing away and our land becoming more vulnerable to drought. It's our forests being cleared faster than they can regrow, habitats being destroyed, our native animals becoming extinct at a terrifying rate, one of the fastest on Earth. That was the backdrop to Professor Samuel's independent review. And what he concluded in his report was that Australia's environmental decline is a direct product of Australia's poor environmental laws. Let me quote a few sentences from page 1 of his report. The EPBC Act is ineffective. It does not enable the Commonwealth to effectively protect environmental matters that are important to the nation. Good outcomes for the environment, including heritage, cannot be achieved under current laws. The overall result from the nation is net environmental decline rather than protection and conservation. They are all quotes from Professor Samuel's report. That is the fundamental, inescapable problem that Samuel identified. We have environmental protection laws in this country that are incapable of protecting the environment. Under the best case scenario, if we implement them effectively and enforce them properly, they can only slow the pace of environmental loss. And what's more, the system is slow, unwieldy, banked up in paperwork, unpredictable and costly for business to navigate. Our laws are not good for the environment, they're not efficient for business, they're not good for anyone. Which is why in our response today, here's one I prepared earlier, in our response today, our government is setting out our broad intentions for reforming Australia's environmental laws. Our response is now public and I really would encourage you to take the time to read it. There's a lot of necessary detail in there, which I'll touch on later in the speech. But at the heart of the reform is a conceptual shift. When we reform our environmental laws, we take them from being nature negative, where we just manage an overall decline in our environment, to nature positive, where we protect our land and leave it in a better state than we found it in. That's the really important point here. We want to stop the slide, but our ambitions are bigger than that. The overall outcomes of these changes baked into law will be a net improvement in nature, not just the defence of the status quo. That's our vision for Australia, net zero and nature positive. It's our commitment to net zero carbon pollution by 2050 and zero new extinctions. It's what we signed up for when we joined 94 nations in supporting the Leaders' Pledge for Nature, a world that is repairing and restoring nature by 2030 and nature positive by 2050. This was a global agreement, and more it's going to be the entry price for doing business around the world. It's what the G7 finance ministers and the G20 environment ministers agreed to when they launched the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Risk Disclosure. This involved central banks and financial regulators coming together and saying, we know that environmental damage is a risk to business and industry. We want to understand that risk and do something to turn it around. That risk is something that environmentalists and business leaders can agree on, which explains why there has been such remarkable consensus around the Samuel Review. Business representatives, environmental organisations, First Nations groups, academics, conservationists, a broad spectrum of Australian society came to the table putting aside their differences to try and fix our broken system. And overwhelmingly, they pointed in the same direction, that we need better, quicker, clearer decisions that protect nature and that people can trust. As Minister, I've been encouraged by this spirit of cooperation, and I want to build on it as we move into the next phase of designing our new environmental laws. If we can agree broadly on what the problems are, it must be possible to agree on some of the solutions. As I said at the National Press Club a few months ago, our government will develop legislation, new laws, by the end of 2023, with the intention of introducing those laws before the end of sittings next year. The reforms will be guided by three essential principles. Firstly, delivering better environmental protection and a nature-positive Australia. Secondly, speeding up decisions and making it easier for companies to do the right thing. And thirdly, restoring integrity and trust in the system. Our first major change will be the introduction of national environmental standards in line with the chief recommendation made by the Samuel Review. At the moment, there is no requirement that approval decisions must leave a positive outcome for the environment, which is one of the reasons that nature is declining in Australia without effective legal protections to stop it. Our reforms will change that by establishing national environmental standards that will write nature-positive outcomes into the law. The standards will be legally enforceable, creating positive requirements for decision-making. They'll describe the outcomes we want, and our new Environmental Protection Agency will make sure those outcomes are being delivered on the ground. We'll consult widely on the details of these standards, but Professor Samuel outlined what one might look like in his review. And I'm quoting, "A decision should protect, conserve and improve outcomes for matters of national environmental significance, such as threatened species." I could do it by interpretive dance if that's
Yes, please do that.
We all want to see that, don't we?
Yes.
In practice, this would mean developers need to avoid impacts where they can, reduce impacts that can't be avoided, and more than compensate for any damage done, so they leave our environment better off overall. Currently, there are 140 individual proposals across New South Wales, Queensland and the ACT that could potentially impact koala habitats. In many parts of the East Coast, these habitats have been under siege for decades now. We're at the point where if we don't make urgent changes to protect these places, koalas could become extinct in New South Wales before 2050, according to a recent state government inquiry. That's the scale of threat that we're dealing with here, which is why our reforms will ensure that development is consistent with our nature-positive, legally enforceable national environmental standards. We'll be working on other standards as well for First Nations engagement so that we can identify cultural heritage concerns early on, for community consultation so that people can understand the impact of projects and provide feedback, and for environmental offsets and regional planning and assessments so that we can be sure that the system is delivering on its promise. These standards will set our national goals for environment protection, and they will complement our second major change, which is regional planning, or bioregional planning as Queensland calls it. A new system of regional planning will allow Australia to fast-track sensible projects in robust places while stopping damaging projects in fragile places. Currently, when a company makes a development proposal, they have to find out, often from scratch, whether a site contains important heritage values, critical habitats, endangered animals or migratory species. It can take years to establish that a proposal is fine, and even longer to establish that a project will have an unacceptable impact when, in many cases, that should have been clear from the start. It adds up to wasted time, wasted money, and massive opportunity cost. With regional planning, we'll be able to map out, quite literally map out, the places where development will have minimal consequences, the places where development will be devastating. And of course, we want to make that as simple as possible to navigate by painting the regional map like a traffic light. Green areas where there are minimal consequences for development, they're the high priority areas where you'd want to see development go ahead. There'll be orange for areas where you can proceed with caution, so you might need to design a project to avoid environmental impacts as much as possible. And there'll be red zones. There'll be red areas for places that are so precious and irreplaceable that they must be avoided. This system will give business certainty, it'll give them clarity, and it will help us build the things we need to build, like the new transmission lines carrying renewable energy, or new homes for Australian families, or transport projects that make life easier for everyone. So I just mentioned 140 proposals that are on our books that could potentially impact koala habitats. Regional plans will also help us address the problem of cumulative impacts, because we won't be dealing with each project in isolation. We'll be considering how they connect and overlap. And that means better conservation planning too, because we'll be managing our threatened species and precious places at a regional scale as real-life ecosystems. That'll guide our conservation and restoration efforts so they can have the greatest impact. These regional plans are something that the federal government will need to work on with states and territories and with local government. All jurisdictions are facing the same challenges, so we have a very strong incentive to work together. I've already discussed regional planning with my colleagues at the Environment Ministers meeting, and there's been a great deal of interest in what we can achieve together. We're in Queensland today, so of course the examples have a kind of Queensland flavour, but Queensland is a particularly good example because it's booming and it's facing tensions between the need for development and the need for environmental protection. So it's why I was so delighted earlier today to announce that we'll be working on regional plans in partnership with the Queensland Government, and it's why we signed an MOU this morning. I'm really pleased to be doing that because Queensland has the highest population growth in Australia. There's a growing demand for homes. We know that Queensland is investing heavily in renewable energy, with the state government committing $145 million to establish 3 new renewable energy zones in northern, central and southern Queensland. And of course the Olympics in Brisbane in 2032, with all of the demands that come with hosting that great event. It means that regional planning makes perfect sense here in Queensland, allowing us to map the places that we need to protect while making it faster and easier to get approvals for the houses, the wind farms and the infrastructure that needs to be built. I'm going to be pursuing some of these regional plans immediately with the Queensland Minister because there are areas of development that we can't sit around and wait for any longer. With the energy mess that we've inherited from the previous federal government, we have no choice but to accelerate the renewable rollout across the country. Under the current system, renewable energy projects are waiting an average of 640 days for federal government approval. And renewable energy transmission lines are waiting 733 days, which is why, as an early focus, I'll be working with Minister Chris Bowen and the states and territories on the urgent creation of renewable energy zones. I've just given up on the microphones. These plans will address assessments and approvals, community consultation and feedback, and the laying down of transmission lines so that we can move our renewable energy from the places it's being generated into the homes and businesses that need that cheaper, cleaner, renewable power. Our third major change will be an overhaul of environmental offsets. The current environment offsets arrangements have a poor reputation for good reason. They often don't lead to better environmental outcomes. In fact, they may deliver no environmental outcome at all because they often allow developers to claim credit for saving an area that would never have been cleared in the first place. We're going to change that system, taking offsets from a net drain on the environment to a genuine benefit. We'll establish a new offset standard embedded in legislation that sets out a hierarchy of action. First, avoid harm to the environment. Second, reduce or mitigate environmental damage.
Sorry. I'm sorry about this.
That's okay. Third, identify offsets within the region that deliver a net gain for the imperilled plants or animals affected by a project. And as a last resort, make a conservation payment to enable a better environmental outcome, one that genuinely leaves nature better off overall. This new conservation... The gremlins don't want me to talk to you today. If I project, can you hear me up the back? Yeah, great. This new conservation payment will send a strong price signal about the value of conservation, making it more clearly worthwhile to avoid damaging nature in the first place. And when people make conservation payments, that money will fund nature repair and habitat restoration to more than compensate for any damage done. That'll be good for business too, by helping them reduce investment risk and calculate the value of their projects more accurately. And once our nature repair market is well established, it'll be easier to find those genuine offsets that match the requirements under our new environmental laws. The new market will allow companies to invest directly in nature, supporting landholders as they manage critical habitats on their property. The fourth and final major reform will be the establishment of an independent Environment Protection Agency. This will help us restore trust in a system that badly needs it. Professor Samuel described distrust as a dominant theme in the 30,000 submissions he received during the review. It's no surprise because up till now, we've just been managing decline. People don't trust the system because it's weak, but also because it's opaque. It's not clear whether environmental conditions placed on projects are being enforced on the ground. The EPA will address that trust deficit. It'll make environmental assessments. It will decide whether projects can proceed and under what conditions, and it will enforce those decisions in the community. The EPA will be governed by its own mission to ensure a nature-positive Australia, while also factoring in social and economic considerations. Our population is predicted to grow beyond 30 million, and we've already got a shortage in housing supply of 200,000 homes. We need development in this country, but it has to be sustainable development in the right places. So we'll also be creating a new data division in our department, which will be responsible for integrating new and existing information, making it accessible and searchable, while reporting the progress we're making against our environmental goals. These changes represent the bones of our reform agenda: national environmental standards, regional planning, offset reform, and a new Environment Protection Agency. They will all be working together in service of our ultimate goal: nature positive environmental outcomes, faster and clearer decisions, implemented by an independent, dedicated agency that everyone can trust. These are the structures of our reforms, but there are a couple of other really important changes that I want to explain to you in the remaining few minutes I have. The first one is on regional forestry agreements. Regional forestry agreements are designed to have regard to environmental values such as old growth forests and wilderness, endangered species and World Heritage matters, but they are currently exempt from the EPBC Act, which make them unique. As part of these reforms, our government will begin a process of applying our new national environmental standards to regional forestry agreements. We will consult with stakeholders on how... We'll consult with stakeholders on how this will be done, because Australia needs timber products and we want forestry jobs. But forests are becoming increasingly valuable for their carbon sequestration and the habitat they provide as well. So we'll work with the industry to support sustainable forestry and the jobs that go with it, and to ensure a healthy balance with our environment. The final point is on climate change and environmental approvals. We support the Samuel recommendation that proponents of large projects be required to publish their lifetime domestic carbon dioxide emissions. Proponents will also be required to disclose what they'll do to manage or offset their emissions in line with Australia's climate targets. And climate will be considered when we do environmental planning too. For instance, when we're considering wildlife corridors and future housing developments. Our goal is to integrate climate considerations into national environmental law without duplicating existing policies for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, such as the safeguard mechanism. So friends, this is a big agenda. Our reforms are seeking to turn the tide in this country, from nature destruction to nature repair. They match what we've done in our first 6 months in office: stronger emission reduction targets with a clear path to net zero, a plan for zero new extinctions on this continent, a commitment to protecting 30% of Australia's land and oceans by 2030, a new nature repair market, reducing waste and building our circular economy, campaigning on the world stage to protect our oceans, to support blue carbon, to fight for a plastic-free Pacific, and $1.8 billion in our budget to protect the Great Barrier Reef, to save our native species, to employ 1,000 new land care rangers, to support new Indigenous protected areas, to fund the Environmental Defenders Office for the first time in 9 years, and to clean up our urban... and to clean up our urban rivers and waterways. These are matters of the highest national interest, but they also place us at the centre of a global movement. Next week, I'll be travelling to Montreal to join the UN Biodiversity Conference, COP15. Our hope is that Montreal can achieve for nature what the Paris Agreement achieved for climate change. We'll bring together governments from around the world to agree on the next phase of our international goals for nature. And I can promise you all this: Australia will be campaigning for strong goals and clear targets. We'll be fighting for the promises we've made to each other to reverse our global decline by 2030 and to be living in harmony with nature by 2050. That's what net zero and nature positive means. And that's what our environmental reforms will achieve in this country. We're proud to be releasing our response to the Samuel Review today. We're proud to be leading the world again to ensure our prosperity, to support our health and well-being and to protect our beautiful home. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.